Okay, so we are examining the Milgram-Roberts unraveling result. And yesterday we saw that unraveling doesn't happen to the fullest extent under one circumstance, which is that there's some doubt whether the documentary evidence is in the possession of the seller, right? If there's a chance that it may not be, then we have incomplete unraveling. Some amount of unraveling happens, right? Some higher range of quality levels totally disclose their information voluntarily, but there's a lower spectrum which does not. Now, here's another, so this is what I'm going to talk about is based on this paper by Harbour and Toe on false modesty. Okay, so there's another set of circumstances where all information won't spill out. So we won't have the full extent of unraveling that Milgram-Roberts talked about. And ironically, you soon see in the very simple model I have constructed, again, I've departed from the paper and simplified the model. It's a more toy model, but I think it brings out the main point. So what you'll see that what arises in equilibrium of this simple toy model is something very interesting. Strategic, self-interested, rational players will sometimes withhold good news about themselves. They will deliberately suppress positive news which ceteris paribus, which would have helped them. What do I have in mind? Here are some examples. It's generally thought that the old rich do not flaunt their wealth. Right? They are not ostentatious. They don't wear, shiny, fancy clothes and watches and drive around in necessarily in expensive cars. They go around low key. Celebrities often, if you see them, on TV programs, they come on talk shows, sometimes kind of shabbily dressed, right? If it's a male celebrity, maybe there's two-day beard. They're not necessarily wearing a suit and a tie or a fancy dress. They're kind of in t-shirt and jeans, that sort of thing. Celebrities dress down in many occasions. Great scholars act humble, right? Lesser scholars sort of brag about, oh, my article has been published in Econometrica and I've got this honor and that honor. They are self-advertising, but great scholars, the Kenneth Arrows of the world apparently are very humble. They don't brag about themselves. They don't, describe themselves with their fancy titles. They don't call themselves Dr. So-and-so or Professor so-and-so or so on and so forth. There's a concept in advertising, which is that if you're selling something very upscale, very high-end, maybe a clothing brand or some sort of, electronics product, a smartphone, very sort of high quality, state-of-the-art smartphone or something like that, or a beverage. The concept is of soft selling, that don't advertise too loudly. Yes, if you advertise, keep it simple, keep it low key. So that's called the soft selling approach. These are all examples of strategic modesty. Okay, at least one way to understand these is through the lens of strategic modesty, which means what is genuine modesty? Genuine modesty is where the person being modest is really doesn't think that he or she is great. Okay, Churchill apparently once in Parliament, he was talking of his political opponent, and he said he's a modest man with much to be modest about. So these are examples where there's something to be immodest about, but the people are not talking about it loudly. Right? But as you will see, it is strategic modesty that the ultimate purpose is to enhance their image and reputation. Okay, so the true underlying motive is not a modest one. Modesty is instrumental. Modesty works out to be a strategy, as you will see, which in the long run actually. So modesty, in that sense, is in this model, and looked at it from this perspective, is going to be a form of bragging, right? It's just smart bragging. Okay, so before I show you the model, what is the key idea? What is the key assumption which drives this sort of strategic modesty? The key idea is, unlike in the simple Milgram-Roberts model that we studied, the tweak that we'll introduce over here is that there are other sources of information. Okay, in the earlier model, we assume that the only kind of document, evidence, information that can be brought to the table is by the seller, right? It's that guy whose qualities are known and so on. Now, sometimes there are other sources of information about that same thing, right? So the buyer could learn, perhaps pick up information because a friend has tried this product, or runs into somebody who talks about his experience, and so on. So that's one thing that we'll bring in. And the other new element that we'll introduce is some sort of noise in the signals. So the signals are not perfect signals. Right? They may be wrong or mistaken, and that has to be taken into account. And the general logic is that we'll have three types, as you will see in the model. There's a good type, there's a mediocre type, and there's a bad type. Yes. And you will see that there are equilibria where bragging serves a purpose. Bragging separates the mediocre from the bad. Okay. Whereas modesty, strategic modesty, separates the good from the mediocre. So the mediocre type will brag. The bad type will have nothing to brag about even. And the good type will have something to brag about, but will withhold that, choose not to brag. Now, in the end, we'll look at welfare analysis, right? And in welfare, we'll see that, because unraveling doesn't happen to the fullest extent, all the document, all the evidence that is in the possession of the players are not necessarily put on the table. That leads to a non-trivial question about, from a welfare perspective, should there be mandatory disclosure laws, right? So if we take it away from the social setting and go back to our examples, like, should there be compulsory labeling of GM products, for example? Yes. You will see that the answer to that, is not clear-cut. There may be cases for compulsory labeling because unraveling does not happen to the fullest extent. Anyway, we'll come to the welfare question later. Let me show you the simple model. Yes, simple.
So can you please explain the third point once again, like extraneous signals?
Let's look at the model. It will become clearer. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Because the model is concrete.
Sir?
Yes.
Sir, so I just wanted to know, when we're saying that there's modesty, does it mean that the agent is not saying anything at all, or is he giving out limited praise?
He's basically not saying. Let me discuss the model, and I think these clarificatory questions will be answered. Okay. Ask me again after I describe the model and the setup to you. All right. So sender-receiver game. Yes. The sender, now think of the sender as being a worker whose productivity theta is unknown, right? And the receiver is a potential employer. And receiver is a competitive employer. So one way to sort of capture that in a simple way is to say that the employer has quadratic preferences, right? So the wage that the receiver offers the receiver offers is the expected productivity of the worker. All right. So we'll take that as a given. Action A is the offered wage, and it will always be expected productivity. Now, ability distribution is common knowledge, we'll assume. And this table captures the nature of the uncertainty that they start with. All right. So productivity can be low, medium, high. And the values to the employer are 0, half, and 1, exactly. So in a full information world, these low types, is a low ability worker, will get a wage of 0. Medium ability will have their wages bid up to half, and the high ability types will have their wages bid up all the way to 1. Right? Wage will reflect productivity. These are the proportions. So there's alpha fraction of low types, beta fraction of high types. The remaining fraction are mediocre types. So a random applicant, a randomly selected worker, is low, medium, high with these probabilities. All right. Standard preferences, as I said, the receiver's preference is this quadratic loss function. I mean, with a minus sign, I've taken the absolute value here. So that means essentially at the end of the day, action will be equal to expectation of theta. And the sender's action is monotonic in A. So the sender or the worker wants to earn as high a wage as possible. And that's as true for the low types as the high types and the medium types. So they'll do whatever they can to increase their action or wage. Okay, so now we introduce 2 pieces of information into this structure. There is a piece of evidence, let's call it E, okay? One example, so to make matters even more concrete and vivid, let's say that, so these workers are sort of academic applicants for the post of a professor. The piece of evidence they may have is a PhD degree, all right? So mediocre and high types hold PhDs. The low types don't hold PhDs. It's not within their ability to earn this, okay? And now, in the game, the medium and high types have an option. They can choose whether to produce their degree or not to the other player. Okay, so they're holding them. They have their degree in their home, but they can bring it out and show it or not. Okay, or they can claim it. Verbally, if challenged, they can show it. Whatever. And we are going to assume that with probability 1, the mediocre and the high types are holding this piece of paper with their degree. And with probability 1, the low type is not holding it. Okay, so this piece of evidence is very clean. Now, in addition to this, there will be another signal which will be publicly observable. So this piece of evidence is something which can only be brought to the table if the worker or the applicant is willing to show it, right? So this is something over which they have a choice to some degree. If they have it, they can decide to show it or not, or talk about it or not. Whereas this other signal arises exogenously and everybody gets to see it. Okay, so what kind of things do I have in mind? So imagine that, there's a prestigious academic prize which will be announced later, right? Like the Nobel Prize, for example. And that's the other signal, yes. And there, the Nobel Prize typically goes to the high ability types, right? They are the ones who are most likely to win it. The mediocre and the low ability types rarely win the Nobel Prize. However, the Nobel Prize is not, there's some element of noise, we'll assume. So this is the conditional probability distribution, that the prize is given, if somebody is the high type, really of the Nobel Prize caliber, then the prize is given to them with probability P. P is greater than half, but is strictly less than 1. With 1 minus P, some deserving candidate doesn't get the prize. Yes, there are plenty of examples we can talk about. Mahatma Gandhi didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize. Leo Tolstoy didn't win the Literature Prize, and so on. Now, if somebody is a mediocre or low type, with probability P, they won't win the prize. Their work is, their accomplishments are not of a level. But sometimes they just get lucky, right? And somebody not really deserving could end up winning the Nobel Prize. Let us not talk about examples. Henry Kissinger, the American Secretary of State, who created a lot of conflict and strife, suffering over the world through his decisions, won the Nobel Peace Prize. So many people would say that's an example of this 1 minus P happening. Yeah. Okay, so now the critical thing, as I said, is that this signal will arise exogenously and nobody can filter it out. Okay, people will get to know the value of the signal anyway later. So if somebody wins the Nobel Prize, it comes in the papers, right? So there's no question of withholding that piece of evidence. Okay, so the game is as follows. The worker has this evidence E if he's mediocre or high type, doesn't have it if he's a low type. He decides whether to show it to the other player, the employer or the general audience. And then this signal gets realized and everybody, including the employer, gets to learn about that. And then the employer chooses the action or the wage and the game ends. Yeah. Yes, Manasvi.
What is the difference between this capital H and the small h?
Capital H is the true state of the world, right?
Okay.
Whereas small h is the value of the signal.
Okay, all right. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So P is the probability that a truly deserving high type individual will get the prize that he deserves. And it's also the probability that a mediocre or low type who's not deserving of the prize will not get the prize. And 1 minus P are. 1 minus P being strictly positive is why there is noise in this signal. Okay, so important element of timing is that the signal will come after the decision whether to brag about the PhD or not. Yes, that's absolutely important. Okay, so this model, so now we have to look at the Bayesian-Nash equilibrium, perfect Bayesian equilibrium, this model. There may be a separating equilibrium under certain parametric conditions. And the separating equilibrium takes the following form. The mediocre type discloses the evidence, shows the degree, flaunts the degree, brags about it. The high type does not. That's why it's kind of separating, right? The expected payoff from disclosure. So let's examine this further, right? Under what circumstances can this sort of behavior be part of an equilibrium? Because this behavior is exactly what we have in mind when we discuss the phenomenon of strategic modesty. The high type is hiding it. The high type's ultimate purpose is to improve the perception. He wants people to think that he's high type, so that he gets the higher salaries, gets higher action. So he's not modest in terms of objective function. He just finds it a useful strategy not to disclose the piece of evidence. Okay, so let's try to see if we can make it work as an equilibrium. Yes. So suppose these are the strategies, right? So then if disclosure, if somebody shows the degree, then immediately their wage or the action they get is half, right? Remember? In this proposed equilibrium, high types deliberately don't show their PhDs and low types don't have PhDs to show. Only the medium types have and are willing to show their PhDs. So anybody who produces a PhD immediately is identified as a medium type for sure and gets the corresponding productivity half, right? And if a high type chooses to deviate from his proposed strategy and shows a degree, then he also will get half because he'll be mistaken to be a mediocre type. We're talking of an equilibrium where high types are not supposed to show their degrees. Okay, now, so that payoff is simple, easy. We have calculated it already. That's like a benchmark. Yes. Now, so let's say the player or the worker does not produce a degree, and then the signal is realized. The prize has been announced, and the prize outcome is either H, our guy has got the prize, or ML, our guy didn't get the prize. And the action or the wage corresponding to these two observations of the signal realizations are essentially these values. Okay. Remember that if the signal is not shown, then the true productivity is either 1 or 0, right? Mediocre has been ruled out. They produce their degrees. So when we don't see the degree, it's a probability distribution over 1 or 0. And whatever the probability of a high type is, that is also expected productivity. Okay. So that is the action or the wage that will result. So when the signal realization is high, okay, this is the Bayesian updating that we are looking at a high type, not a low type. This is the probability that it's a high type. Remaining probability, it's a low type. And there's 0 probability this is a mediocre type because we are talking of somebody who hasn't shown a PhD degree to us. Similarly, after we don't see the degree and we see that this guy has not won the prize, there's still a chance that he may be a high type, but this is the, using Bayes' rule, this is that probability, okay? We can, Bayes' rule should be bread and butter to you. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining this. I mean, this is the probability after, conditioning on 2 observations. One is that this guy didn't show us a degree, and 2 is that this guy didn't win the prize, right? Okay, so given these 2 things, what's the probability that he's a high type actually? Well, beta is the prior probability, remember, before we receive any information. Beta is the probability he's a high type. Alpha is the probability he's a low type. So if he's a high type, then chance of him winning the prize would be P. Okay, so that's one way in which the observation could come about. Another way in which our observation or conditioning event could arise is the guy's actually a low type and he just got extremely lucky, which is with probability 1 minus P. Right? So this is standard Bayes' rule. This is a combined probability of the event we have observed, and this is the probability of the event and the type being high. Okay, so these are the expected actions or wages. So now I'm a high type, let's say. I am thinking, oh, if I show my degree, I'll immediately get half. My wage will be pinned there. If I don't show my degree, I don't know what my wage at the end of the day is going to be. If I win the prize, I'll get this. If I don't win the prize, I'll get that. And now what is my expected wage? So my decision whether to follow my proposed equilibrium strategy or not, or whether to deviate from it, will depend on my expected wage, right? So it's the probability weighted average of these 2 possible wages. What are the probabilities? I'll get this higher wage if I win the prize. I'll get this lower wage if I don't win the prize. The probability of me winning the prize is P, remember? And the probability of me not winning the prize is 1 minus P. So my expected wage, if I'm a high type, is this average, this probability weighted average, which works out to be this, right? We have calculated age, AML, so we insert those things. So for the high type, this expression, what it works out to be, has to be greater than half for them to find it optimal to be modest. Now, the mediocre type has to find it optimal to brag. So there are 2 incentive constraints, right? We're trying to sustain an equilibrium where the high type brags and the mediocre type brags and the high type practices modesty. So we'll have two inequalities or constraints to satisfy. One is this expression has to be bigger than half. The other is the mediocre type is also sitting around and thinking, oh, I'm bragging, but maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I can get more by that high type if I practice modesty. Well, what is the expected action or wage if he practices modesty? It's also some weighted average, except that the probabilities will be flipped, right? He'll get the higher wage with a lower probability. He'll just have to turn out to be extremely lucky to end up in that state, which is much more likely that he will get the lower wage because he won't win the prize. So you flip the probabilities, you get this different expression, and this has to be less than half. Okay, so imagine that this is greater than half and the expression on the bottom is less than half, then we have both incentive constraints satisfied. And it is indeed a best response for high types to be modest and for low types to brag. Now, one thing you can show, and the intuition is pretty obvious, that these two expressions, this expression is higher than this expression. Why is that? That's purely because, for the expected wage of the high type, more weight is put on the higher wage. Right? When he wins the prize, he gets a higher wage, of course, and he's more likely to win the prize and end up with a higher wage than the mediocre guy. Right? So that's why his expected wage calculations give us a bigger number than this. And all we need is half to be sitting in between these numbers, right? So this is the ultimate condition. And clearly we can easily choose parameters so that this happens. So for example, if P, let me go back one slide. Suppose P is very close to half, then can we have this sort of separating equilibrium? Anybody? Can you have strategic modesty as part of an equilibrium when P is very close to half?
No, sir. No, sir. It will become more and more difficult for the employer to determine who is high type and medium type.
What is the intuition?
Because the second signal will stop, the second signal would stop conveying any information about the type of the person. Because with half probability, medium or low type would win the prize, and with half probability, high type would. So we don't know who is actually winning the prize.
Yes. So in other words, their incentives are almost identical when P is very close to half, right? The only difference between their expected wages arises from the fact that P is away from the center, right? The high type is more likely to win the prize on a higher salary. He has the confidence. The low type doesn't feel very confident. He can try to be modest, but then most likely the word about his brilliance will never reach anybody's ears because he won't win any prizes and accomplishments, right? That is the key. That is what creates a wedge between the payoff from modesty, from initial modesty for high types and mediocre types. Now, if P is going towards half, that means these prizes are handed out almost by lottery. They have very little information content, and mediocre types are almost as likely to win the prize as high types. That's what people have or tending to have means. And then both these expected wages will approach the same limiting point. And either that limiting point is less than half or it's more than half. It can't be on two sides of half. So there are situations when the prize is extremely noisy, where no modest equilibrium exists. But you take the other extreme, P approaches 1. And then, purely mechanically, you can see that, you take these expressions and calculate the limit P approaching 1. You will find that, the expected wage of the mediocre guy approaches 0 and that of the high type approaches 1, okay? Because mediocre type almost surely is going to not win the prize. And when he doesn't win the prize, people think almost surely he's a low type, because the mediocre types anyway bragged and separated themselves earlier. So he's very likely a low type because the price is very accurate. So this wage approaches 0 and this P is approaching 1. So the mediocre type's expected payoff approaches 0 and the high type's expected payoff approaches 1 as the external signal becomes close to perfectly accurate. So for high enough P, in other words, this inequality can be satisfied and we'll have a modest equilibrium. Yes? Questions?
Sir, when we were talking about the probability, like the proportion of each type, so we said that the low types have proportion alpha, the high types are beta, and mediums are 1 minus alpha minus beta.
Right.
But when we're talking about the probability of winning a prize, then we have only got 2 categories. So shouldn't we also break down this into 3 categories?
Yes, but the equilibrium that we are looking at, which we have tried to construct, has an initial separation, right? The modest types possess that evidence, PhD degree, and they don't get into any risk. In equilibrium, they show the PhD degree. And immediately they're identified as the mediocre type and they're given a wage half and they just, separate themselves right at the beginning from the other 2 types. Yes. So now we are looking at people or a worker who has not produced a PhD degree. So among that set, it's either high type or low type. The mediocre types in equilibrium never belong to that set, that they have the degree and haven't produced it. That's not their strategy. The strategy is to brag. If they have the degree, they show it. Yes, so that's why in the later stage, after the prize result has been announced, when Bayesian updating is happening, Bayesian updating, remember in these games, again, spirit of Nash equilibrium, it is calculated based on the equilibrium strategies of the different players and the different types. So the mediocre type would have shown, so we know 2 things. We are doing a Bayesian updating based on 2 things. One, this guy didn't show us a PhD or didn't brag about a PhD. That's the first thing we observed. Second thing we observed is that this guy didn't win the prize. Okay? So mediocre is ruled out on the first point. It didn't show us the degree. The equilibrium strategy of the mediocre type is to show us the degree. So it can't be the mediocre type. And now, the only 2 types remaining are high and low. And we update our beliefs based on the prizes, the uncertainty latent in the prize outcome captured in P. So in principle, 3 types, but in equilibrium, given the strategy of the mediocre type, it boils down to 2 types after we see the test result, after we see the prize result. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. So just one follow-up doubt. So when like the high type has the risk of being, identified as a low type, right? Because if the median type has a degree, then the mediocre type will show it.
Yeah.
So when we were calculating the expected wage, shouldn't we be doing it for the low type, like AEH minus AEL?
We can do it for the low type, but it doesn't matter, okay? We only have to do it for the high and the medium type because why are we calculating the expected wage? Because we want to make sure that the medium type finds it optimal to brag and the high type finds it optimal to be modest. For the low type, as I said, quoting Churchill, the low type is modest because he has much to be modest about. It's not even a choice whether he wants to be modest because he doesn't have that degree to show. Right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Like I was just thinking that the second signal won't be able to distinguish between the low type and the high type because we don't know who won before the second signal is there.
It will be able to distinguish, but imperfectly. Right?
Yes, sir.
we won't end up with certainty, but our posterior beliefs, after observing the price announcement, will move towards the extremes, closer to 1 or closer to 0, depending on whether he got the price or not. Because of the noise element in the price, it will never be certain.
Yes, sir.
Okay, now, in this paper, yes, Simran.
So just one question. So this third point that you're talking about as alpha tends to 0, this point, will that hold irrespective of P's value?
Well, you fix a value of P. See, I mean, you can, in any, expression, the order of taking limits, often, you get different limits if you take two variables towards, let's say, 0 in one order rather than another order, right? So when I say alpha tending to 0, I'm fixing some value of P. Holding P at some level, whatever that level is. If we take alpha towards 0, then whatever I've written here followed after that. Now, if you want to think of double limits, alpha going to 0, P going to 1, or P going to half, then that calculation will depend on, in general, will depend on what is the order of taking limits. Anyway, let me not complicate it much. Here, ceteris paribus, I'm taking alpha towards 0, holding the other parameters fixed.
Right, sir. So I think my main doubt was that even if supposedly we're saying that the low types are scarce, and if we say that the probability of the high type winning a prize is always 1, so will that not essentially take care of separating equilibrium in the sense that whoever wins the prize is by default the high type? And I mean, there will be a separating.
We don't look at the corner case. Even here in the previous point, I wasn't looking at P literally equal to 1. I'm saying let's take P closer and closer towards 1, but still strictly less. Yes. And as far as this point is concerned, the second last bullet point, take some interior P, strictly less than 1, strictly greater than half. Freeze its value, and then consider lower and lower values of alpha. So what this is saying is that as you take alpha arbitrarily close to 0, holding everything else fixed, including P, you will find from the expressions that the expected wage of the high type approaches 1, and the expected wage of the mediocre type also approaches 1. Okay, so why is that? The bottom line is that when the low types are very scarce in the population, this sort of modest equilibrium does not exist. Yes. There will be some sort of pooling equilibrium. Either both types will brag or both types will be modest. Well, actually, both types will brag in that case.
But sir, why would that be? I mean, I don't get it. Why would the high type still want to brag if there are no low types?
Yes, so they may both want to be modest also, right? So you can have a pooling equilibrium of both of modest. In fact, in the little empirical test that I'm going to talk about, that's what happens. Yes. I'll tell you the intuition of what's going on here. Okay. So the key intuition is this. Bragging is a way of the mediocre guys to separate themselves from the low types. Yes? Think of the separating equilibrium we just constructed, right? Provided the parameters are helpful. What's happening there? Mediocre guys show their accomplishments, their PhD degrees, whatever, right at the beginning. because they're very worried that people will perceive them as low types, right? They also have this ambition that, it'll be great if people think I'm a high type, or I'm a high type with good probability. But their main worry is that they'll be perceived as low or lowish. And that's why they hurriedly, put everything on the table. The high type, so that's why they brag. The high types are more worried about separating themselves from the mediocre, not so much from the low and mediocre. And that's why they take a gamble. They're very confident that, there's a very good chance they'll win this prize and it will be splashed in the newspapers and everybody will come to know about it, including their potential employers. So they take that gamble. Yes. But essentially, their main focus is on trying to separate themselves from the mediocre. So the mediocre is trying to separate themselves from the low types, and the high types are trying to separate themselves from the mediocre types. Now, if there are very few low types to begin with, then the mediocre don't have that concern that they want to separate from the low. So they might as well be honest, be modest, and modesty will convey no information, or almost no information in that case. Right? So in a situation where alpha is very close to 0, you can have modesty, but modesty contains hardly any information because everybody is modest. Right? The modesty contains good information in this sort of separating equilibrium that we just discussed, and that requires a healthy amount of alpha, because without that alpha, even the mediocre guys will not want to brag. They're bragging because they're saying, oh, there's this sizable chunk of low types out there, but I'm not one of them. I'll prove it to you. I'll show you my degree from this prestigious institute. Yes. If 1 in 10,000 are low types, then I'm not too worried that people will perceive me as one of them. They're very, very rare anyway. That's the intuition. Yeah. Mechanically, you can all check it out. The condition for this separating equilibrium we have derived, right? These are the expected wages. They have to sit on two sides of half. And one way to kind of, is to just drill your way through and show that if alpha is low enough, then these two expected wages cannot be on both sides of half. But that's just algebra, right? The intuition is roughly what I described. Okay, now make sure that you see the heading of this slide. Pay no attention to it. I don't know why I wrote it down. Anyway, so in this paper, they run a nice little test for this. So they collected data on, there's many, many campuses of the University of California. And so what these guys did in the paper, in the second half of the paper, after putting out their model, is they collected for each of these various campuses. There are some well-known campuses like, University of California and Berkeley, but then there are less prestigious campuses too. So they collected the course syllabus handed out by the various teachers in these universities. And they noted how they describe themselves, whether they call themselves, for example, a doctor, or whether they put a PhD after their names in their course syllabus. And also they checked out their voicemail messages, right? Whether in the voicemail message, how do they describe themselves? Again, whether they use these honorifics or not. Okay, now, for these kinds of universities, there are some universities like Berkeley, for example, where practically every faculty member has a PhD, right? There will be very few exceptions. And those are typically junior faculty who are still tying up their PhDs, right? They have submitted their thesis perhaps, and they haven't yet defended it, but will happen anytime soon. But there are other campuses where lots of the teachers, lots of the professors have maybe a master's degree. Many don't have PhDs. And they wanted to check if the behaviors the way people self-describe on the course syllabus or in their voicemail messages, whether that differs systematically across these campuses. So there are these non-doctoral universities or colleges, meaning they don't have PhD programs. They are the less prestigious ones. They're not the Berkeleys, they're the other obscure ones. And then there's doctorate granting campuses or universities like Berkeley and so on, or UCLA. Now, in the non-doctoral, less prestigious campuses, nearly half the teachers don't hold PhDs at one point in time. In the doctoral places, 80% hold PhDs. The remaining 20% are either people waiting for PhDs or they're senior graduate students who are teaching, who have been given to teach a course. They're working on their PhDs, that sort of thing. Anyway, but look at the compositions. And if you move to full-time faculty, then you see even a stark difference. As I said, 98% of full-time faculty, not temps, have PhDs in doctoral places, but a pretty big chunk, 20%, don't have PhDs in these other campuses. Now, look at the behavior differences. So here, alpha is like 0.02. It's like 2%. Here, alpha is 20%. Yes. So as far as the voicemail title is concerned, in non-doctoral places, a quarter of them call themselves doctor. And in campuses like Berkeley, almost nobody does. Right? It's less than 4%. On the syllabus title, in the non-doctoral places, 3/4 call themselves by their degrees. In the doctoral places, much higher than this 3%, but still. So this difference is statistically significant given the sample size. So systematic difference. And again, the intuition is obvious, right? In campuses like Berkeley, PhD is nothing. I mean, almost every faculty member holds a PhD degree. That's hardly something to brag about. But in campuses where it's much more mixed, some of the professors have masters, others have PhDs. Those who have PhDs they have a much stronger incentive to announce that so that people don't think they're in that other 20% crowd. Yes, so that's why you see the big behavior difference. Questions? No questions?
Sir, I have a very trivial question.
Yeah.
How are we saying that the expected payoff from disclosure would be half? Like that only in equilibrium, right?
Of course, in equilibrium, I mean, all the comparisons have to be in equilibrium. Even if I deviate from what I'm supposed to do, others will think that I am, at least as long as that's not obvious, others will think I'm sticking to equilibrium. So calculation of the payoffs will be with respect to the proposed equilibrium strategies of everyone. Yes?
Okay, sir. Got it, sir.
So maybe I'm a high type, but I just lost my nerve. Rationally, I should have stuck to a path of being modest. But somehow I made a mistake, I lost my nerve, and I go around brandishing my degree. Well, people still think I'm a mediocre type. High type's not supposed to act like this. That's the entire, I mean, asymmetric information is at the heart of all of this. So if a high type deviates and produces a degree, that type is perceived as a medium type whose productivity is half, and that's why he's paid half. Okay, so the final bit is this. Now, of course, these are just amusing examples. They're not particularly serious. Who cares, how professors print their course syllabus? That's not the point. That's not the scope of application. Let's go back to the serious ones, like, issues about product labeling, for example. Yeah. should there be regulation which calls for compulsory product labeling or compulsory financial disclosure by firms, for example? To what extent do corporates and firms have to disclose their financial bottom lines? That's another regulatory issue, yes. So let's revisit the question of mandatory disclosure laws. What are their welfare impact? And that you can easily do in this structure, right? So I'll take specific values just to illustrate a possibility. Let's say equal number of all types, right? Alpha equal to beta equal to 1 minus alpha minus beta equal to 1/3. And essentially, we run the same things that we did before. The wages conditional on winning the prize and not winning the prize are P and 1 minus P. And the separation, so these are the expected wages of the high type and the mediocre types, and they have to be on two sides of half. Now, we'll have to compare two regimes, one in which there's no compulsory disclosure law, right? So producing that evidence E is a choice. And then that leads to this sort of game, and we have a separating equilibrium of strategic modesty in this game. The other regime that can be imposed is that people have to show the E. They're not even allowed by law to practice false modesty, right? If you're talking of companies and their financial disclosures, it is an option for a company like Apple to practice strategic modesty, but not by not releasing a press statement about how rich they are and how much cash reserves they're sitting on. But if the law says they have to, publicly announce their accountant's report and their audits, then they don't have an option to practice such modesty. Anyway, so we'll compare the ex-ante expected payoff of the receiver under these two regimes. One in which there's no regulation and strategic modesty happens in equilibrium. Another in which whoever has the E has to disclose the E. Okay, so in the game, we can calculate R's expected payoff. It's this. Now, if there's mandatory disclosure, then, these are the expected wages, okay? The low types will always get 0. It's mandatory to disclose the E. So if you cannot show the E, that means you're a low type, your wage is pegged at 0. For the high and the mediocre types, the wage will depend on whether they win the prize or not. Both of them are forced to show the E. When the prize, do they get the prize or not? So their expected wage calculations are simple. They're these, okay? And receiver's expected payoff again, and this is just to keep your head down and do this calculation. We can just calculate it. And you can show that under a compulsory disclosure regime, the receiver is better off, right? The trade-off is as follows. If it's not made compulsory, then mediocre types are identified very precisely. They brag and they're singled out. They have a PhD to show, and they actually show it to us. So we know, oh, this guy is a mediocre type, right? Mediocre types are well identified under a laissez-faire regime. In a compulsory disclosure regime, the low types are well identified because they have to produce the E if they have it, and low types don't have it. So low types are well identified. High and mediocre types are not, okay? So that's the informational trade-off between the two regimes. And sometimes one will be better, sometimes the other will be better. So I've just chosen some numbers to show you that there are situations where mandatory disclosure creates a welfare improvement, at least as far as the receiver is concerned. Okay. So the question, the policy question about how much informational regulation there should be. Should companies be forced to disclose their financials, their various other things, their product composition, and so on. Based on the theory we have studied, I mean, often the answer is it could go either way. So it becomes an empirical issue. But at least we have learned something, hopefully, that what are the pros and cons, right? We have a more concrete understanding of that based on these papers, Milgram Roberts onwards, which hopefully can put some structure on our thinking. Okay, so that's that. I'm done with the communication topic.